This bill is one of the most consequential measures Congress has passed in years to protect America's security and the future, the very future of Western democracy.
And even as loud voices here at home insisted on abandoning the responsibilities of leadership, America stepped up and the Senate held firm.
The deal is done. Late last night, the Senate overwhelmingly passed the House foreign aid package, a major win for President Biden and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Now the rush is on to supply Ukraine with much needed ammunition and missiles after months of negotiations. Former President Trump, who successfully urged Republicans to originally kill a bill with border security provisions attached, seems to have mixed views on the deal. But in the end, this is a major win for Democrats. Plus, day 2 of Trump's hush money trial wrapped after the first witness, David Pecker, took the stand for hours of testimony. The first reactions from what was revealed soon. But first, The Hill's Mychael Schnell joins me to help make sense of what's next for the long-awaited foreign aid package. Mychael, my friend, thank you so much for joining us. Just to kick it off, what do we know about the vote last night that passed, and when will it land on President Biden's desk?
Yeah, Julia, that vote last night was a huge deal, months in the making to get this foreign aid package across the finish line. Essentially, this package was comprised of 4 separate bills: a bill to send aid to Israel, one to send aid to Ukraine, one to send aid to allies in the Indo-Pacific, and a fourth sort of grab bag of national security priorities, one of which being a potential ban on TikTok, essentially saying that ByteDance, the China-based parent company of TikTok, must divest in the platform TikTok within the next year, or else the platform will face a ban in the U.S. So the Senate passed all those 4 bills in one package last night. I believe it had about an overwhelming bipartisan vote, a number of Democrats, a number of Republicans, and the next stop is going to be President Biden's desk. Now, that's expected to happen sometime today, once essentially the Congress processes the bill. There are some procedural things that it has to go through. President Biden has said on a number of occasions he plans to sign this piece of legislation as soon as it lands on his desk. And then, Julia, that aid can start getting to embattled allies overseas.
Yeah, Mychael, and I just want to go back to TikTok for 1 second. We know that there's been bipartisan support for, maybe a ban on TikTok going forward, but talk about the support on the Hill for this forced sale or an eventual ban on the app.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, Julia, is a little while back, we saw the House hold a vote on just a TikTok ban, a straight up potential TikTok ban bill. It was essentially saying that ByteDance had to divest in TikTok within the next 6 months, or else it would face a ban in the U.S. That saw widespread support, bipartisan support. It had more than 300 votes in the House, which these days you don't really see much have that sort of coalition of support in the lower chamber. And then it went on to the Senate, and its odds were unclear in the Senate. But, now we're seeing that actually get to the President Biden's desk. There was a tweak made that got a key Senate Democrat, Maria Cantwell, on board. It was changing that divestment period from 6 months to a year. So that could have been something that picked up more support and allowed this to go through. But yeah, there has been widespread support for a potential ban of TikTok. It's in the House and in the Senate. And it's as lawmakers sort of become more hawkish on China and become concerned about the national security threats that are through that app, with the China-based company collecting data on Americans.
So back to the foreign aid package, you mentioned that as soon as President Biden signs that legislation, the process can begin to get aid to Israel and Ukraine. Do you have any idea of how long that will take once he signs the legislation to get that aid getting into Israeli and Ukrainian hands?
Yeah, the expectation is it can happen in the next couple days. And remember, this was one of the reasons why lawmakers were really adamant that now was the time that Congress had to approve this aid for Ukraine and Israel, but particularly for Ukraine. It was those national security briefings, those intelligence briefings that they received that shows that Kyiv is really in a make or break moment in its war against Russia. It needs these supplies. It needs this aid from the U.S. to continue to defend itself against this war against Russia, to fend off this invasion from Russia. So I spoke to a number of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in recent weeks, Julia, and essentially the main theme was Ukraine needs this money now. They need the support now. They are at a critical turning point in the war. No more time can be wasted. That being said, once President Biden's pen hits the paper and he signs this piece of legislation, it is well expected that this aid will be heading to those embattled U.S. allies within the next few days, again, because lawmakers have really, and President Biden himself, have really underscored that urgency here.
Yeah, absolutely. And President Biden was very much involved in pushing that. But so was former President Trump. And we saw he flexed his political muscles throughout the negotiation process for the foreign aid package. But ultimately, it seems like Republicans are sticking up to his pressure. Was the passage a sign that Trump's influence is starting to shrink within the party?
It's sort of twofold, Julia, because first off, former President Trump had been very adamant that he didn't want more aid to Ukraine for months, right? That had been his position. He had been saying, we don't need to send more aid to Ukraine. We need to take care of America's borders. And then we saw him sort of soften that stance, I guess, a little bit, you could say. We saw the former president call for this idea of sending aid to Ukraine as a loan. And when he stood beside Speaker Mike Johnson at Mar-a-Lago a few weeks ago, he again upped that idea of a loan. And when asked about Ukraine aid, he did not totally push it off to the side. So this is something that Speaker Johnson embraced. And part of that bill was having language in there that would make some of the aid that goes to allies overseas in the form of a loan. So I think that, we sort of saw former President Trump soften his stance a bit as we went through this process, going from no Ukraine aid at all to saying, well, I like this concept of a loan. It was really an interesting sort of change and tone from the former president. But yeah, I mean, we see folks like J.D. Vance in the Senate who are very close to the former president, people like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, very close to the president, who were adamantly opposed to Ukraine aid. Well, Speaker Johnson and, of course, both leaders in the Senate plowed ahead and put this aid on the floor. So there's some ways that you can look at it. Former President Trump softening his stance, embracing this idea of a loan, but also Trump's fiercest allies on Capitol Hill saying no to more Ukraine aid and leadership putting it on the floor.
And speaking of Marjorie Taylor Greene, all eyes are on her after continued threats to try and oust Speaker Mike Johnson. Are House Republicans starting to turn on her, or is she shoring up support?
I mean, look, she is only a band of three right now, Julia. And look, on Capitol Hill, a band of three is powerful. You can do a lot, but it doesn't look like Congresswoman Greene wants to use her power right now. She filed this motion to vacate around a month ago, but hasn't actually forced a vote on it. And now she does have two co-sponsors, Congressman Thomas Massie and Congressman Paul Gosar, both Republicans, but they haven't had this interest in forcing a vote on it. So essentially what we have here, Julia, is that motion to vacate resolution hanging in the abyss. But unless a lawmaker forces a vote on it, there's actually no movement and no action there. And look, I've asked Congresswoman Greene essentially every time I have seen her, has the time come? When do you plan to force a vote on this resolution? What exactly are you waiting for? She's been coy, waffling on this idea and essentially saying that she wants Mike Johnson to resign and she does not want to do this in a hasty way. But look, I've also spoken to a number of Republicans who are very frustrated with the effort that Congresswoman Greene is dangling right now. They don't think that motion to vacate is what Congress needs right now. They don't want another 3 weeks of paralysis. They don't know who would succeed Johnson. Remember, that race to succeed McCarthy back in October was drawn out, but they had to cycle through three other candidates before landing on Speaker Johnson. So yeah, Congresswoman Greene does not have a lot of support right now in the GOP conference for this effort. Right now, it's only two lawmakers. And again, I've described this as a pale but powerless effort, Julia. It does not have a lot of support. But if she were to force a vote on it, because of the rules of the House, she would be able to have that vote.
Yeah, and you're right. There is no plan B from Republicans once again if Johnson were to be ousted. I want to switch gears. Anti-war protesters across college campuses continue as more arrests happened last night. College presidents are fighting to quell these protests, but could they just end up like former Harvard president Claudine Gay, who was forced to step down after backlash on how she handled anti-Semitism on that college campus?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. We're hearing from a number of lawmakers right now calling on the president of Columbia to step down because of these protests that are taking place on campus and because of this anti-Semitism that is right now rampant on these college campuses. And, today, Speaker Mike Johnson is actually planning to go to Columbia, go to the city, and he's holding a press conference where he's going to talk about this rampant anti-Semitism on campus and take questions about it. So it's possible that he could join the chorus of voices calling on the Columbia president to resign. But look, this is becoming a real big issue on Capitol Hill. We saw New York Republicans on Columbia's campus earlier this week. We saw a number of Jewish Democrats visit Columbia earlier this week. Now we're seeing the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, to visit Columbia. This is really becoming a big issue in Washington when lawmakers return to the Capitol next week. I think it's very possible we'll see some legislation about this, absolutely increased conversations about this. And we'll remember back after that anti-Semitism hearing, that's when Claudine Gay stepped down from her presidency at Harvard. It was after that questioning by Elise Stefanik. So Congress has really had a big role to play in this conversation about anti-Semitism on college campuses, and I don't expect that to wane anytime soon.
Yeah, and speaking of lawmakers, the House has slimmed down to just a one-vote majority for Republicans, but tensions are higher than ever. What's going on between Texas Congressman Tony Gonzalez and the GOP's right flank? We know that he's facing, a closely watched primary challenge.
Yeah, Julia, it's about as thin as you can get here. Congressman Mike Gallagher resigning officially over the weekend, making it this one vote margin. And you'd think that in situations like this, lawmakers, especially of the same party, should show some unity, get along, so they can sort of show a united front, as there is this very slim majority. That's just not the case for Republicans right now. There's a battle brewing within the House GOP conference between conservatives and moderate Republican Tony Gonzalez. He hails from Texas. And essentially what happened is Gonzalez is right now running for re-election. He had a primary back in March where he didn't get 50% of the vote. So he's now headed to a runoff against his opponent, Brandon Herrera. And essentially what happened was on Sunday, Gonzalez was on CNN's State of the Union, and he called Matt Gaetz and Bob Good, two Republicans in the House, scumbags. Essentially how I described it as kicking the hornet's nest that then galvanized Gaetz and Good to come back at Gonzalez, endorse his primary opponent, Brandon Herrera, and sort of hurl insults back at Tony Gonzalez. Now, that is not just being held to Bob Good and Matt Gaetz, but other conservatives are coming to the defense of the members of the right flank, Eli Crane, Ralph Norman, Chip Roy, essentially, piling up on Tony Gonzalez. And this all comes ahead of his runoff race on May 28th. We're already hearing from more Republicans that they plan to endorse Brandon Herrera. Congressman Ralph Norman, Republican from South Carolina, told me yesterday he is planning to formally endorse Brandon Herrera. So, it all goes, as you mentioned, Julia, that one vote margin. You need this unity within the ranks up on Capitol Hill. And that's just not happening right now in the House Republican Conference. In fact, it's the complete opposite. There is this bitter infighting, and it doesn't really help anybody try to get legislative priorities done.
I want to stay on the subject of primaries because Pennsylvania held its primaries last night. What were the major takeaways from you?
Yeah, well, one of them being just like we're finally seeing some voting in Pennsylvania, which is, of course, going to be a key swing state when we get to the November elections. I'm, of course, a congressperson, I'm a House person, so I found it interesting that Summer Lee was able to fend off that primary challenge. There's been a lot of conversation about the progressive wing of the party, especially when you talk about the Israel's war against Hamas, and more progressives, raising concerns about the Israeli government and about how the Biden administration not placing conditions on aid for Israel. Summer Lee, though, squeaking out a primary victory. Another interesting thing I thought, Julia, is when you look at some of the crosstabs, Nikki Haley is still pulling in a good amount of support, even though she's been off the, out of the race for, I think it's at least more than a month now. You're the expert with the campaigns. She is still pulling in support, which to me is fascinating because when you talk about these races, President Biden and former President Trump are so neck and neck in a number of these key swing states that you'd think that one of them would want to be courting these Nikki Haley voters. Clearly, they're still up for grabs if they're still casting votes for her, even though she is well out of the race. So I thought that was a really interesting, thing in the crosstabs, and definitely something that's raising some alarm bells for Trump and Biden, or rather, getting them to the table to try to figure out, strategize how they can get those voters on their side.
Yeah, I think the last count I saw was 16% of the vote went for Haley. I mean, that's huge in a very much a swing state like Pennsylvania when there's so many electoral college votes up for grabs. Moving to the presidential campaign trail, but also kind of sticking with your beat in the House, President Biden is hoping to gain support with young progressives. Who is stepping up to help the president reach these voters?
Yeah, it's an unlikely foot soldier here, Julia, because it's somebody who used to be critical of the president. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she has really emerged as a key progressive surrogate for President Biden on the campaign trail. We've seen this on a number of occasions, especially in the recent week. And, the progressive wing at one point had been unsure of President Biden's candidacy. I remember there was, Pramila Jayapal, the chairwoman of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. She had sort of been unsure if President Biden was the right person to carry the progressive views. This was back in 2020. Jayapal had endorsed somebody else at that time. But then she came around to supporting President Biden. And we're now seeing that among other progressives as well. One of them being Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's really been an interesting evolution for these progressives. And this comes at an important time because, Julia, it's what I mentioned before, as progressives are sort of coming a bit uneasy with President Biden's leadership amid Israel's war against Hamas. We saw in Michigan there were a number of voters who cast their ballots for that undeclared. It was the undeclared candidate or of that nature. Essentially, not for Biden, not for Trump, not for Biden in the primary, a real rebuke of the president's leadership. So the fact that you're having AOC, who is a beloved progressive, on the trail for Biden, that could help sway some progressive voters. At least that's what the Biden campaign is really hoping for.
Yeah, I really can't emphasize how politically important it is for both of these parties to be united going into November. Mychael Schnell, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Julia.
Trump's hush money trial kicked off this week, and prosecutors aren't holding back, accusing the former president of trying to influence the 2016 election and cooking his books to hide hush money payments. With so much on the line, how is Trump handling the courtroom pressure? Plus, the former president's lawyers are stepping in front of the Supreme Court today, hoping to argue Trump has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for his efforts to stay in power after the 2020 presidential election. Joining me now is my colleague, The Hill's Zach Schoenfeld, who is covering the historic trial. Zach, thanks so much for joining us. Judge Juan Merchan railed against Trump's attorneys over his imposed gag order, but not going as far to rule that Trump violated the gag order. How quickly could this change if Trump speaks out again on social media?
Well, the judge, after this hearing, when he went over these 10 posts that prosecutors has raised and accused Trump of violating his gag order, the judge has now reserved decision on it. So we're now waiting to see when he comes back with the ruling. We could get that tomorrow when the trial reconvenes, or maybe it'll be a little bit later. So what we're watching for is, first of all, does he make a finding that Donald Trump violated his gag order in this case in any of the 10 posts in question? And then if he answers yes to that question, the next question becomes, what is the punishment? The judge here has two options. Option number one is a fine, a max of $1,000. That's what prosecutors are asking for. But it'll also be interesting because the judge does have within his discretion to put Donald Trump in jail for a short period of time if he finds there's a violation. So it'll be interesting to see, maybe he'll go with the fine route this time because that's what prosecutors are asking for. But it'll be interesting to see if he gives any sort of warning to Trump for the future.
So in addition to the gag order saga or back and forth, the jury has heard testimony from David Pecker, ex-publisher of the National Enquirer, surrounding his catch and kill method with stories regarding Trump. What, if anything, new was revealed yesterday?
Well, the basic contours of this agreement between the National Enquirer and the Trump campaign back in 2016, where the National Enquirer tabloid would look for negative information about Trump and then, attempt to quash it to prevent it from ever coming to light publicly. We knew the basics of that agreement. It had come out before. But I think there's two things that stood out from David Pecker's testimony. The first thing is that we just saw how in-depth that this agreement went and how unusual this was to have such an agreement between a tabloid and a Republican nominee for president. So I think that's the first thing, is just how granular and how much into the weeds we got of some of these meetings going on between the National Enquirer and the Trump campaign. And the second thing is, even of the information we already knew, a lot of that had come out before in written court filings and a non-prosecution agreement a few years back. But now we actually saw David Pecker in the flesh take the stand in open court. So I think also just how this was presented to jurors is very different than what we've seen before.
Trump is in a very unique situation here, running for president, being a former president, having multiple criminal trials he's involved in. So how has the former president been reacting in court? Are there any signs of nervousness or trepidation?
I wouldn't put it as nervousness, but I do think there's an uncomfortableness to it. Donald Trump is someone who spent many years in control, whether it be his time in the White House or even before then as he was building his real estate empire. But when Donald Trump is walking into this courtroom every day, he is not in control, even on the little things, right? His legal team at one point was asking to turn up the temperature in the room. At another point, Donald Trump had thought the proceedings were over one day, so he stood up getting ready to leave. Things hadn't quite wrapped up, and so the judge told him to sit back down. And And so, some harmless moments there, but I think it just shows that even on the little stuff, Donald Trump is just suddenly not in control. And it's just a very different environment with dozens of journalists sitting in the courtroom every day, watching Donald Trump's every move, every time he closes his eyes and maybe appears to fall asleep. Every single thing he does is being watched. And I think it's just quite an uncomfortable environment for him.
Well, and one of the biggest aspects Trump doesn't have control over in this case is testimony that is yet to come from Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels. What is expected once they take the witness stand?
I think jurors are going to see two very different pictures of who some of these witnesses are, right? Take Michael Cohen. Prosecutors are going to start their direct examination and, they'll admit that, Michael Cohen has some baggage, right? He has a criminal record. He has admitted to lying to a federal judge before. So I think prosecutors, they're going to acknowledge that. But what they're going to attempt to convince jurors is that you don't have to believe Michael Cohen's words because everything he's saying, in their view, is backed up by documents and other evidence. But when they finish, Trump's lawyers are going to get up there and paint a completely different picture of Michael Cohen. They are going to get up there and attempt to demolish his credibility. They are going to attempt to convince jurors that he cannot be trusted because Michael Cohen is such a key witness for prosecutors. That's really the key aspect for Trump's legal team. If they can convince jurors here to not trust Michael Cohen, to not believe his testimony implicating Trump, that could be a big decision when that jury goes back for deliberations.
So back here in Washington, Trump's lawyers are arguing before the Supreme Court, hoping to convince the court that Trump is immune from criminal prosecution. What exactly are they trying to argue, and how far-reaching could this be?
So this argument will take place on Thursday, but it will. So Donald Trump's lawyers are arguing that he has presidential immunity from criminal charges for any official acts committed while in office. So if you ask his legal team, in their view, that means that all of the other cases, to put the hush money one to the side, but the three other cases, the two election-related cases and then the classified documents case, they say that if the Supreme Court agrees with their view of presidential immunity, that those charges have to go. Now, legal experts I talked to are viewing this largely as a long shot effort. Every judge that has so far considered these immunity claims has rejected it. But of course, the Supreme Court is now going to have the last word. But it's also important because, in addition to whatever the Supreme Court decides and, whether they find immunity, in addition to that, regardless of their decision, the timing is important here because there's still a narrow window before November for any of these other trials to get to the election. So if the Supreme Court, doesn't release this decision all the way until the end of their term in the end of June, it becomes a lot more difficult to see these cases getting to trial before November.
Zach Schoenfeld, I know that you have an incredibly busy schedule, not only covering this trial, but the three other criminal trials former President Trump is involved in, plus the Supreme Court. So thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. Non-compete clauses may soon be a thing of the past for most workers. In a 3-2 vote, the Federal Trade Commission voted Tuesday to ban the practice for-profit companies. The commission did allow for non-compete agreements for senior executives to remain in force. The FTC says that for approximately 1 in 5 U.S. workers that are bound by a non-compete clause, it means they cannot freely switch jobs for better pay or benefits. The new rule is expected to boost benefits and wages by $488 million over the next 10 years. It's set to take effect 100 days after it is published in the Federal Register, but legal challenges are expected to delay that. In the meantime, the FTC says employees who have signed a non-compete will still be bound by it. United Health confirmed this week that it paid a ransom to protect patient information after its subsidiary, Change Healthcare, was the target of a cyber attack back in February. United Health says 22 screenshots allegedly taken from Change Healthcare were posted for about a week on the dark web. Those screenshots, it says, contained personal health and identification information. However, officials say they have not seen enough evidence that doctors' charts or medical histories were among the data. United Health says it will likely take several months to identify and notify the people impacted. In the meantime, the company set up call centers to offer free credit monitoring and identity theft protections for 2 years for those who were affected by the hack. Speaker Mike Johnson has revealed that his sons almost drowned following a meeting at Mar-a-Lago last year. The speaker visited former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago property in Florida the week of Thanksgiving for a fundraiser. According to The Atlantic, a riptide swept out Johnson's sons and they had to be rescued by lifeguards on jet skis. Johnson says he and Trump spoke on the phone following the incident. And before we go, we'd like to remind everyone that today is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, a day to remember and honor the 1.5 million victims of the Armenian genocide that happened 109 years ago. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.